For years, the Titanic has been remembered as the ship that was supposed to be impossible to sink. But there is a problem with that story. How unsinkable was the Titanic actually considered before it sailed? At the beginning of the 20th century, ocean travel was entering a new era. Ships were becoming larger, faster, and more technologically advanced. The Olympic class was designed as a symbol of that progress. Titanic was the second of three enormous ships built by the White Star Line. It was constructed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, alongside its sister ship, Olympic. The scale of the project was extraordinary. Titanic stretched nearly 900 feet in length. It carried hundreds of passengers and crew across multiple decks, but its size was only part of the story. What made Titanic remarkable was the technology built into its design. The ship was divided into a series of watertight compartments. These compartments were designed to limit flooding if the hull was damaged. The idea was simple. If one section flooded, the surrounding sections could remain dry. That gave Titanic a reputation for exceptional safety. But there is an important distinction. Ship designed to resist flooding is not the same thing as a ship that is physically incapable of sinking. And that distinction would become crucial only after the disaster. The word unsinkable existed before Titanic ever entered the Atlantic. It was not originally a magical promise, it was a description of confidence. In modern shipbuilding, the Olympic class was promoted as a major achievement in engineering. Its size, technology, and safety systems were repeatedly emphasized. That created a powerful impression. But there is an important difference between saying a ship was highly resistant to sinking and saying that it could never sink. Those two ideas are not the same. Some newspapers and publications used language that made the distinction less clear. And once Titanic sank, that language took on a completely different meaning. A ship believed to be impossible to sink had sunk. But history is rarely that simple. To understand what people actually believed before the disaster, we need to separate contemporary evidence from the legend that developed afterward. People wanted to understand how a ship of such size and reputation could have been lost. The word unsinkable provided a powerful contrast. It made the disaster easier to explain emotionally, even when the technical reality was more complicated. The ship had not been designed with the assumption that nothing could ever sink it. It had been designed with limits. Those limits became visible only when the damage exceeded what the design could withstand. That distinction is central to understanding the disaster. Titanic was not a magical ship that suddenly violated the laws of physics. It was an advanced ship operating within the engineering assumptions of its time. When those assumptions were overwhelmed, the safety systems were no longer enough. The tragedy was, therefore, not simply a story about a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. It was also a story about how confidence in technology can become misunderstood after a disaster, and once the legend became established, it was repeated for generations. A ship associated with extraordinary safety had been lost in the middle of the ocean. Over time, the word unsinkable became more than a description. It became part of the identity of the Titanic itself. But there was a problem. The stronger the legend became, the harder it was to see what people had actually believed before the disaster. The myth was not created from nothing. It grew from something real. The Titanic's remarkable engineering, its reputation for safety, and the confidence of the age that built it. But the myth became stronger than the original evidence. That is the important discovery. Titanic was not famous because it was truly impossible to sink. It became famous because people later remembered it as the ship that was never supposed to sink. The phrase unsinkable survived because it was emotionally powerful. But the historical evidence is more careful. The Titanic was an exceptionally advanced ship for its time. Its safety systems were significant. Its reputation for safety was real. But no evidence shows that the entire public, or even everyone connected to the ship, believed that it was literally impossible to sink. That distinction matters, because once a myth becomes familiar, it can become difficult to separate what people actually believed from what later generations remembered. The Titanic is therefore not only a story about an iceberg and a sinking ship. It is also a story about how history becomes legend. And sometimes, the most interesting part of a famous story is discovering that the version we remember was never quite the version that existed. The Titanic only needed to become a symbol of confidence, progress, and safety. After the disaster, that confidence became part of the tragedy itself. And once the story was repeated often enough, the distinction between what was actually claimed and what people later remembered became harder to see. So perhaps the real lesson of the Titanic is not that people were foolish enough to believe a ship could never sink. It is that history can turn a complicated truth into a much simpler story. And once that story becomes familiar, it can feel more real than the evidence that created it. The Titanic sank more than a century ago, but the story of the unsinkable ship is still being rewritten. The question is, what other famous stories do we remember differently from what actually happened?